It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're descending into the strange, quiet shadows of medieval justice, following the footsteps of a man feared by all, but understood by none, the executioner. Not a monster, not quite a villain, and not entirely free to walk away. If you enjoy these long, sleepless walks through history, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if it feels right. And if you're listening from a train platform, a quiet kitchen, or a tired hospital shift, let me know where you are. I love knowing who's out there in the dark. Now, let's begin. Dim the light sand, let's drift back in time. You could smell him before you saw him. Not for lack of hygiene, he was cleaner than most, actually. A man so often coated in blood cannot afford to be careless with water. But still, he carried it. That scent, a heaviness in the air, a human stench beneath the soap, like iron and burned rope and guilt. In the early spring of 1361 of the Common Era, the town of Netlingen lay half sunk in thawing snow. The cobbles glistened with meltwater, carts stuck in the mud, chickens refused to leave their perches, and everyone walked a little faster through the square. No one wanted to loiter this morning, not with the rope going up, and he stood there, as he always did, near the scaffold, but not on it. Coat buttoned, hands folded behind his back, expression unreadable. A man in the profession of death, waiting like a clerk for his appointment. His name was Jakob, though few said it. In Turdlingen, he was known mostly by what he did, der Nekrechter, the executioner. He had not always been this thing. Once, he had been the son of a tanner. A quiet boy, lanky and pale, good with numbers and gentle with animals. He had no taste for violence, but death. Death had a way of noticing people like him, quiet ones who did not run from its presence. When his uncle died, choked on a herringbone in an alley, or so the town record said, Jakob was the only male heir to the family profession. And in Turdlingen, the office of executioner was a family trade. Once marked, your bloodline bore the stain. A son could not be a priest, or a blacksmith, or a notary not, if his father had taken heads. Jakob had tried to say no. He really had. But there are limits to refusal, when the village already sees you as half dead. And so he became the man who killed, but could not be touched. Because that was the thing, he was needed, yes, paid, grudgingly, given food, housing, a booth at the weekly market, but no one could touch him. Not a handshake, not a shared cup, not a daughter offered in marriage. Even when he walked through the churchyard, people held their breath as if the scent of sin clung to his coat. He would stand there, morning after morning, at the edge of the market square, watching the townspeople gather like birds. And they, in turn, would not meet his eyes. And once the rope was ready, once the final prayers had been mumbled by a priest too afraid to offer absolution directly, Jakob would climb the steps, nod to the bailiff, and perform the act. 1 swing, if he was lucky. 2, if the sword was dull. 3, and the dreams would return. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back, before the rope, before the sword, to the first time he said yes, and wondered what it would cost him. Shall we? The first thing you must understand is that there was no school for this. No guild, no patron saint, no mentoring circle of fellow executioners sipping wine by candlelight and comparing swing techniques. There were only men like Jakob, men who never asked for the work, but found themselves branded by it. There was no one to ask, am I doing this right? There was only the blade, the rope, the bone beneath the neck, and the sound a body makes when it realizes it's no longer a person. Jakob had heard that sound hundreds of times, and it still made his stomach clench. Not in fear, exactly. More in sympathy. A full-body flinch of something like guilt, or grief, or perhaps just a vague, unnameable discomfort at having once again made a clean separation between life and what came after. It had been 7 years since he accepted the post. Not that he marked anniversaries. But there was a stiffness in his left hand now, a tremor that came after too many executions in a single month. And there were fewer people now who remembered the boy he had once been. They only saw what he was, the man who held the sword. He had learned by watching, quietly, reluctantly, at 15. He had stood behind his uncle during executions, pretending to look away but never missing a detail. How the neck stretched under tension, how the muscles twitched even after the blade had done its work, how the crowd gasped, and then, a moment later, turned back to their bread rolls and errands as though nothing had happened. The town needed him, of course. Every town did. The illusion of justice required someone to do the irreversible, and to do it neatly. No matter how pious, or small, or sick with their own moral contradictions, each city-state in the Holy Roman Empire kept a man like Jakob somewhere at the margins, just far enough from the cathedral to keep things clean. There were rules too, though most were unspoken. Jakob could not live within the town walls. His cottage was just beyond the east gate, where the grass refused to grow and the soil was rumored to stink of blood. He was paid from a special fund that did not appear in the town's public ledgers, and he was forbidden, by custom if not by law, from entering taverns during feast days. It wasn't superstition, exactly. It was contamination, like rot. People believed the touch of the executioner could bring bad harvests, sick calves, miscarriages. Even the bread he bought was handled with tongs. Children were warned not to follow him home, even though he never once raised his voice at them. But despite all this, despite the isolation, the stares, the half-muttered prayers made in his whack, Jakob endured, because someone had to. And, strange as it may sound, he took pride in his work. Not joy, never that, but pride. There was dignity in doing the unspeakable with care, in making the death quick, in sharpening the blade each morning, in memorizing the rites so that, if the priest faltered or refused, he could whisper the final words himself. He was feared, yes, but he was also trusted more than they would ever admit. He carried confessions in his silence, secrets no one else was willing to hear. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Jakob would sit by his fire and recite the names, not to remember exactly, but to give them back, as if, by speaking them, he might place the burden outside his body for a few minutes, as if names alone could exorcise a life. The town pretended not to see him, but he saw everything. He knew which aldermen beat their wives, which priests drank from the sacristy chalice, which merchants had turned in their own cousins to the magistrate to save their reputations, and none of it made the job easier. It just made it heavier, because in the end, even executioners want to be seen, not watched. Seen, but to be seen is to be touched, and Jakob could never be touched again. There was a boy once, 16, maybe 17, with hands to clean and eyes too eager. He arrived at Jakob's door just after midsummer, shoulders squared in a borrowed tunic, claiming to be the son of a baker who had run off with a tax collector's wife. Whether it was true or not, Jakob never asked. The boy's story changed each week anyway. Sometimes he was orphaned, sometimes abandoned. Once, he said he had been cursed by a traveling friar who caught him stealing apples. All Jakob knew was that the boy wouldn't leave. He had knocked for 3 days straight. Jakob ignored him, fed the chickens, sharpened his blade, poured rainwater into a cracked basin, and watched the reflection of clouds pass by. On the 3rd morning, the boy was still there, soaked to the bone, shivering, lips blue from cold or desperation, possibly both. "Why?" Jakob asked through the door. His voice came out lower than he intended. "I want to learn," the boy said. "What do you do?" Jakob didn't answer right away. He opened the door, looked at the child in front of him because he was a child. Truly, and thought about how long it had been since someone had looked him in the eye without flinching. "You don't," he said quietly. "Not really." The boy nodded anyway. And Jakob, against his better judgment, let him in. His name was Elias, though he later confessed he had picked it up from a grave marker outside Augsburg. His real name, he said, was too easy to curse. Jakob didn't argue. They shared soup that first night quietly, awkwardly, and Elias fell asleep on a pile of rags beside the hearth. He snored, softly, like a kitten. Jakob should have sent him away. He didn't. For the first few weeks, he gave Elias only small tasks: cleaning tools, feeding the chickens, boiling water, fetching herbs from the woods nearby. Executioner or not, Jakob knew the value of a poultice. The boy was eager, nimble, annoyingly curious. He asked too many questions, laughed at his own jokes, hummed when he swept the floor. He had a gap between his front teeth and a habit of chewing on his thumb when nervous. He reminded Jakob of himself before the silence settled in. But the job had no room for light. The first time Jakob took him to a hanging, Elias vomited behind a wagon. Not from the sight of death, he barely saw the moment, but from the waiting, the way the crowd grew quiet before the drop, the way the condemned man trembled while pretending he was at peace, the way Jakob stood perfectly still, as if none of it touched him. Later that night, by the fire, Elias asked, "Does it get easier?" Jakob stared into the flames. Then he said, "No, you just learn not to show it." Elias stayed. Whether from stubbornness or loneliness, Jakob didn't know. He started asking fewer questions, started watching more closely. He learned the knots, learned when to speak and when to keep still. He never touched Jakob's tools without permission, and slowly Jakob began to teach him not just the mechanics, but the rituals, the posture, the gravity, the invisible script that governed every execution, every moment of public death. Because it mattered, not just for the sake of the crowd, but for the dead. "It's not a performance," Jakob told him once, while they cleaned the sword. "It's a departure. They deserve dignity." Elias nodded. He had stopped humming by then. And one night, weeks later, Jakob woke up from another dream, the kind where the faces blur and the voices scream without mouths, sitting upright, staring into the dark. "You dream of them too?" the boy asked, voice like a whisper, barely hanging on. Jakob nodded, and they sat like that for hours, silent, awake, listening to ghosts that would not leave. There were days when the work felt routine, almost bureaucratic. Not that Jakob would ever say so aloud, but it was true. The human body, after enough encounters, becomes a series of anticipated resistances. Skin gives, muscle clings, bone interrupts. You adjust, and you do it quickly, not because you're in a hurry, but because hesitation is cruelty in disguise. But paperwork, that was the real agony. Every death had to be recorded. Every sentence, signed and sealed by the magistrate, had to be accounted for down to the exact hour, method, and final words. Jakob's ledger was cleaner than most accountants. Bound in black leather, pages marked with neat, narrow script. He wrote by candlelight, after washing his hands. Always after. It was, in its way, the only sacred act left to him. Not the killing, but the remembering. The town clerk, a soft-bellied man named Albrecht, once made the mistake of chuckling over Jakob's meticulous notes. "You do know they're criminals, not saints," he said, thumbing through a week's entries. Jakob looked at him, eyes unblinking. They were people, once. Albrecht never laughed at the ledger again. But routine did not mean numbness. In fact, the repetition made the weight harder to carry. It was the small things that crept in the calloused palm of a man who used to make shoes. The quiver in a widow's lip as she tried to meet Jakob's gaze. The rasping breath of a boy no older than Elias who had stolen a silver spoon. Jakob executed him anyway. Quietly, cleanly. Then he went home and wept into a bowl of stew that had long gone cold. Food rarely tasted like anything anymore. Bread felt like ash in his mouth, no matter how fresh. Meat was worse. The blood reminded him of warm mornings in the square. He often skipped supper now. Elias pretended not to notice, leaving small plates by the fire that went untouched. It wasn't that Jakob had lost the will to eat. It was that appetite felt ... disrespectful, as if pleasure, even mild, was something his hands no longer deserved. The townsfolk didn't see this version of him, of course. They saw the black coat, the gloved hands, the solemn face. They didn't see the man who lit candles for the dead, even when they spat at him, who whispered apologies before each strike, who held Elias's shoulder, gently, after every execution, to remind them both that they were still, somehow, human. And then came the reckoning. It started small, as reckonings often do. A missing bolt from the stocks. A miscounted set of iron shackles. A guard who fell ill, then didn't wake up. Whispers in the tavern. Rumors of a spirit walking the gallows at night. Eyes glowing red. Jakob ignored them at first. People needed stories to feel safe. If the dead became vengeful ghosts, it was easier than facing the quiet truth that justice was often just organized fear, dressed up in robes and rituals. But Elias was worried. He had seen a girl praying outside their cottage, not to God, to the condemned, leaving wildflowers and bits of meat, as if bargaining. "What does she want?" Elias asked. "To feel less powerless," Jakob said. He didn't add that power, once held, is rarely a comfort, especially when it comes with a blade. The next man Jakob was ordered to execute had no trial. Oh, there had been paperwork. Always paperwork. Signed with wax in the magistrate's seal, folded thrice over like a prayer too dangerous to speak aloud. But no witnesses came forward. No priest offered counsel. No family claimed the body afterward. Jakob knew what that meant. The town wanted him gone quietly, efficiently, without the spectacle of public justice. Some men die in the square, others in the dark. The condemned was a man named Wilhelm, broad-shouldered, quiet, a cooper by trade barrels, casks, wooden tubs. He had a wife once, and a little girl who died in the plague. After that, he stopped speaking to most people, worked odd hours, lived near the river, never raised his voice, never asked for credit at the baker's. The charge was heresy, though Jakob suspected it was something messier. Land disputes, unpaid debts. Perhaps Wilhelm had seen something he wasn't meant to, or perhaps he was just inconvenient. Grief makes men forget how to flatter authority. Elias watched as Jakob read the sentence aloud, voice like cold iron. There were no guards, no ceremony, just the three of them. Wilhelm bound, Jakob with his gloves. Elias, holding the basin. It wasn't a hanging. This was a beheading. With no audience, no scaffold, just the dirt behind Jakob's cottage, where the soil was soft and the worms plentiful. Jakob sharpened the blade himself. Slowly, methodically, he offered Wilhelm water, which was refused. He asked if he wished to say anything, but Wilhelm only shook his head. When the moment came, Elias looked away. Jakob did not. The sound, as always, was louder than expected. Final. The kind of sound that doesn't echo, but sinks deep, like a stone thrown into still water. And when it was over, Jakob did not move. Not at first. He stood there, breathing through his nose, eyes unfocused. The sword hung from his hand like an anchor. Blood pooled at his boots. "Should I get the shovel?" Elias asked after a long pause. Jakob nodded, barely. They buried Wilhelm near the edge of the property, beneath the crooked tree that never bore fruit. No marker, just a mound of earth and a silence that stretched too long. That night, Jakob didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with the sword in his lap, hands motionless, as if waiting for it to speak. Elias stayed up with him, pretending to mend a tunic, but his stitches were crooked. His hands trembled too. "Why do they do it this way?" he asked finally. Jakob didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "Because silence is cheaper than justice." They sat in the dark until morning. No dreams, no words. Just the quiet knowledge that some deaths were meant to be remembered, and others to be erased. Jakob had made a life out of drawing that line. But lately, the line had started to blur. Jakob washed his hands obsessively, 3 times before each execution, twice afterward, once again before bed, even if the blood had long since dried or never spilled at all. It was not superstition, not entirely. The super coarse, lie-heavy block that stung his knuckles was a kind of ritual, a poor man's ablution, a small ceremony to tell the skin, "You did something terrible, but you are still here." Elias watched him once, during one of those long evenings when the work was done but the dread had not yet lifted. "Does it help?" he asked, voice hesitant. "No," Jakob replied, scrubbing the skin raw, "but it gives me something to do." The water turned pink, then cloudy, then still. There was always a residue that never quite came off. Not on the hands, on the mind. Some executioners drank, others hoard. Still others disappeared into the woods for days at a time, howling at trees and cursing their mothers' names. Jakob did none of these. He cleaned, he chopped wood, he read old sermons aloud to no one, and he wrote names into a secret ledger, the one no clerk ever saw. It was bound in calfskin, pages thin and browning, on each a name, a date, a cause, a note, sometimes, in the margins, cried for his brother, bit through her tongue, refused the priest, forgave me. He kept this ledger beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth, not for legacy, for balance, for a sense that, if anyone ever found it, they might understand that he had seen them, that their deaths were not footnotes, but moments. In the village, they burned incense during Mass to drive out evil. Jakobi burned herbs in his own way. Dried juniper, crushed mint, thyme if he could find it. He let the smoke curl around his arms like a benediction. Not holy, but human. A scent to overlay the memory of burning flesh, the peculiar acrid stink of bodies, rendered nameless. Sometimes he whispered over the smoke, names, usually, or fragments of prayers from childhood. He never asked Elias to join him, but once, quietly, The boy placed a clove of garlic near the coals. "Superstition," Jakob said. "I know," Elias replied. "But sometimes it helps." And in that moment, it did. There's something strange about professions that traffic in finality. The rest of the world moves in loops, planting, harvesting, love, forgiveness, old quarrels resumed. But execution was an end, a full stop. It removed someone from the sentence of history, and yet Jakob carried every punctuation, every breath. He remembered a man who had once taught Latin to village boys, kneeling before the block with dignity intact. Another who'd confessed to murder, but wept when shown the gallows. A third who had no tongue left to plead, only eyes that begged the world to listen. And always the smell, the bitter, sweet iron tang that clung to his coat even after hours in the wind. It was memory's cologne. No one else noticed it anymore, but Jakob did. He lit the herbs again. The room filled with soft smoke. The sword leaned against the wall, silent. He did not pray. He did not believe. But in the quiet swirl of incense and sorrow, he felt briefly that maybe someone was listening, even if it was only Elias, or the ghosts, or himself. Feast days were the cruelest. Not the executions, not even the last-minute ones, when a nobleman demanded justice before supper, but the celebrations. The holidays where the whole town came out in ribbons and song, where pigs turned on spits and children smeared honey on their faces, where ale flowed in sloppy arcs and someone always got too drunk and wept at the beauty of bread. Jakob hated them, not for what they were, but for what they reminded him of, that he had no seat among them. It was an unspoken rule, but ironclad. At the spring feast of Saint Odelia, when the whole village gathered in the main square with wreaths in their hair and sweet wine in their mouths, Jakob sat on a stool behind his cottage, eating plain barley from a cracked bowl. His portion had been delivered, neatly wrapped, left on the ground by a baker's apprentice who would not meet his gaze. Elias, to his credit, always stayed behind too. The boy claimed he hated crowds, claimed he was afraid of open fires, but Jakob knew it for what it was. Loyalty in its rawest, stupidest form. "You could go," Jakob said one year, stirring the barley until it resembled paste. "No one would blame you." Elias shrugged. "They'd still know where I live." He meant it without bitterness. That's what made it worse. Later that evening, Jakob walked alone to the edge of the square, not to join, just to watch. From the shadows near the cooper's shed, he could see the dancers spinning in circles, shoes kicking up dust, cheeks flushed from joy or drink or both. A fiddler played off-key, but no one minded. Laughter rang like bells. The priest's robes were stained with wine. He used to think that if he just waited long enough, the rules would soften, that someone would wave him over, offer a slice of cake, ask about his health, but they never did, and he stopped expecting it. Children had once dared each other to touch him, laughing, shrieking, then running as though cursed. Now they simply turned their backs. He was not hated, exactly, not loved, certainly. He was endured, a necessary man with a polluted soul. Behind him, Elias leaned against a post, eating an apple. "They're dancing," the boy said. "Yes, you ever dance?" Jakob paused. "Once, a long time ago, with a girl." He smiled faintly. "No, with my sister." Elias blinked. "You had a sister." Everyone had someone, once. They said nothing after that. The music grew louder, then softer, then stopped. A cheer rose from the crowd, and fireworks, if you could call them, that were lit by the tanner's boy. Flares of red and gold, sparked against the black sky. People clapped, kissed, stumbled home. Life, as it liked to do, returned to its rhythm. Jakob watched until the last flame burned out. Then he turned back toward the cottage, toward the sword, toward the silence. The feast had ended. His hunger had not. It came by accident. A piece of folded parchment, half tucked inside a parcel of herbs, delivered by a trader from Rothenburg. The bundle was meant for Eliassi, had begun learning the basics of medicine, patching wounds when Jakob returned with blood on his sleeves. But the note had no name, no wax seal, just a line of writing so small and precise it looked stitched instead of penned. He unfolded it, slowly, carefully. "You do not have to keep doing this," it read. "There are other ways to serve. No signature, no direction, no flourish. Just that, a single sentence. Like a breath let out into a dark room, hoping someone would hear." Jakob stared at it for a long time. It was not a threat, not a warning, not a summons from the town elders or the magistrate. Those were always formal, always sealed, always heavy with ink and pretense. This was a whisper, flattened into parchment. He burned it that night, piece by piece. And yet, he found himself waking, hours later, in the chill of pre-dawn, the words echoing not in his ears, but in his chest. You do not have to keep doing this. The notion was absurd, romantic, dangerous. His role was bound to him not by chains, but by need, by silence, by the dirty arithmetic of a town that required his hands but not his presence. Still, he could not stop wondering, what if someone had left the note years ago? Would he have listened? Would the blade have stayed sheathed even once? He told no one, not Elias, not even the tree by Wilhelm's grave, where he sometimes spoke under his breath when the weight got too heavy. But something shifted after the letter. Slightly, quietly, he lingered longer in town just to watch. Not as a warning, but as a question. He watched children chase each other past the fountain. Watched a man kiss his wife's palm while she laughed and swatted at a bee. Watched a girl drop a loaf of bread and cry, only to be given another, freely, by a stranger. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but it was motion, life refusing to sit still. Jakob went home and polished the sword until his reflection no longer looked like a stranger. Then he turned to Elias, who was boiling roots for a poultice. "If you weren't here," Jakob asked softly, "what would you be?" Elias blinked, surprised. "I don't know. A scribe, maybe. Or a gravedigger. Someone quiet." Jakob nodded. "Good work, honest." Elias set the spoon down. Why? No reason, but he lied. He was wondering what Elias might become if he left, if he walked beyond the border of the town, if he disappeared into a different life, one where blood was not currency. The next morning, Jakob walked to the edge of the eastern road, just to look. The fields rolled on like old stories, worn thin from use. The trees whispered nothing new, and the wind did not care who he had killed. He stood there a long time, long enough to wonder if mercy could begin with walking away. They came for her in the middle of the night. Not with torches or hounds, this was no mob. It was worse, it was official. 2 constables, their breath fogging in the cold, arrived at the home of Isolde Korgmer, wife of the town's most respected bellmaker. She opened the door herself, in slippers and a house robe, hair still damp from evening washing. Her children slept in the back room. Her husband had died the previous winter, struck down by a fever so sudden, the town healer called it God's haste. She was not a woman people disliked. She had taught 3 girls to read. helped rebuild the thatching on the blacksmith shed. She brewed a pain tonic that even the aldermen quietly requested when their joints began to scream. None of it mattered. By dawn, she was in the jail. The charge, poisoning. Her neighbor's daughter had taken ill after a meal, and somehow, without proof or context, the blame fell to a Stoda. Women alone were always suspicious. Women with knowledge, doubly so. Jakob was summoned 3 days later. He didn't know her well, but he remembered her laugh, low and warm, like something made of bread and smoke. He'd seen her once offer a ribbon to a weeping child after a parade, kneeling to tie it in the girl's hair. He'd never imagined her here, in this place marked for the sword. "I didn't do it," she said when they met. Her voice wasn't desperate. It was resigned, as if the world had already decided her role in this final story, and now she merely wished to correct the punctuation. "I believe you," Jakob said. It wasn't something he often said. Belief didn't matter much in his line of work. But this time, he said it, meant it. "Then don't do it," she replied. And that was the knife. Not the one he would be asked to carry, but the one she placed in his hands without moving. The suggestion of mercy, unspoken but heavy, aching with its own kind of impossible. "I can't," he said after a long silence. "You've done harder things." She smiled then. Just once, a quiet curve of the lips, not bitter, not mocking, just tired. "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." The execution was scheduled for market day. Jakob petitioned to have it moved, privately, quietly, under the old fig tree near the outer well. The magistrate agreed without question. Everyone wanted this one done without spectacle. Some deaths were meant to be forgotten before they even finished happening. The morning came cold. Elias wrapped the cloth around the blade. Jakob spoke less than usual. No prayers, no final rites. Just a glance between them, Jakob and Isolde, that said everything. It was over in a breath. And afterward, when the earth had been packed, when Elias was rinsing the cloth in the stream, Jakob stood alone beneath the tree. She didn't scream, he whispered. Elias looked up. "None of them do. With you," Jakob didn't respond, because what he meant was something else entirely. She forgave me with her silence. It arrived in the usual way, wrapped in rough cloth, left at the edge of Jakob's doorstep just before dawn. A loaf of coarse bread, still warm, with a note tucked underneath that read only, "For the work no one thanks you for." At first, Jakob thought it was pity, then charity, then something worse. He broke the loaf in half. Inside, embedded deep in the dough, was a coin. Not large, not golden, not valuable in the way markets understand. It was iron, stamped crudely, worn on one edge, as if it had been carried in a pocket for years. But it bore a symbol he recognized, a broken wheel. St. Catherine's wheel. It was a sign, and not a kind one. Catherine, the patron of the falsely accused, of philosophers, maidens, and those who dared to argue with power. Her wheel had been meant to torture her, but legend said it shattered at her touch. To place that symbol in bread meant something. Not just a message, but a condemnation. You break what the saints would save. Jakob stared at the coin for a long time, longer than he meant to. Then he placed it on the table, unwrapped the sword, laid them side by side, as if to ask them which one was heavier. Elias returned later that morning, breath fogging in the cold, a satchel of herbs slung over his shoulder. "Bread?" he asked, peering into the cloth. Jakob nodded. From someone with poor manners and worse theology. Elias picked up the coin, turned it in his palm. "You think it's a warning? I think it's a memory," Jakob said. Someone remembers what it's like to bleed for nothing. They didn't eat the bread. Instead, Jakob took it to the forest, dug a hole by the roots of a half-dead ash tree, and buried it. He did not believe in omens, but he knew symbols carried weight. And this one, it felt less like an accusation and more like a question. How long until you, too, are judged? That night, he sharpened the blade slowly. It wasn't dull, but rituals, once broken, have a way of haunting their keepers. He needed the rhythm, the rasp of stone against metal, the memory of doing something well, even if that thing was death. Elias watched from the doorway. He didn't speak, just stood there, arms folded, as if trying to measure the distance between survival and guilt. You know, Jakob said, without looking up, I used to believe that doing it well made it better. Elias said nothing. Now I think, maybe it just makes it quieter. Outside, the wind picked up. A low, steady moan that rustled the shutters and bent the trees just slightly westward. The kind of wind that feels like it's looking for someone. Jakob didn't flinch. He held the sword and wondered who will bury me when it's my turn. Summer arrived with an edge that year. Heat came early, baking the cobbles into mirrors and coaxing rot from the barrels in the cellar. Flies clung to windowsills like beads on rosaries. Even the magistrate seemed to sweat guilt from his collar, fanning himself with edicts and groaning about the smell of people. And amid it all, a name. Whispers first, then proclamations, inked in harsh strokes. Anselm of Lechfeld, condemned for defiance, sedition, inciting unrest. No trial, just a sentence. Jakob's domain. Anselm had once been a friar, or maybe just a mason who quoted scripture too well. Either way, he had a gift. Not for preaching, exactly, for noticing, for asking questions no one wanted asked. Why do the poor pay for the sins of the rich? Why is silence mistaken for piety? Why do we punish hunger with rope? He didn't lead marches, he led conversations. And that, it turned out, was more dangerous. Jakob met him the day before the execution. You're younger than I expected, he said, offering Anselm water through the bars. And you're quieter, the prisoner replied, drinking slowly. I thought you'd carry your sins louder. Jakob didn't bristle. Not anymore. There's a tone some men take when they've already made peace with dying. You can't be angry at someone who knows how to leave the world well. You believe in mercy, Jakob asked. Anselm smiled. I believe in memory. It's the only thing stronger than fear. The square was packed the next day, not because of bloodlust, not even curiosity, but because everyone had heard what he said, and whether they loved or loathed him, they wanted to see if he'd beg. He didn't. Jakob helped him onto the platform. His hands were steady. His eyes were open. He looked at the crowd not as an enemy, but as a mirror. He saw them, all of them. The silence was not reverent, it was afraid. Do you wish to speak? Jakob asked. Anselm nodded, took a step forward, and in a voice that didn't need to shout, he said, Forgive each other more icily than you forgive yourselves. That is the only justice worth chasing. Then he turned and knelt, and Jakob, for the first time in years, hesitated. It was not long, a breath, the soft tremor of a man remembering how to pause. Then it was done. The body fell. The people did not cheer. They dispersed like fog. And Jakob sat that night with Elias, polishing the blade, saying nothing. But he left the man's name in the ledger, and next to it, for the first time, a full sentence. He made me want to live differently. Some executions were loud. not because of the condemned but because of the crowd. Jakob remembered those well. The shouts, the jeers, the righteous anger of townsfolk convinced that their suffering had found a scapegoat. Thieves who'd stolen too little to matter. Witches who healed too quickly. Men whose only crime was outliving a noble's embarrassment. In those moments, justice was theatre. Jakob, the actor. The sword, a prop made of consequence. The death, an intermission before dinner. But not this time. After Anselm's execution, the quiet clung like soot. No bells rang. No bread was handed out. The crowd had come with eyes wide and mouths open and left blinking, unsure if they'd seen justice or just another man disappear. Jakob felt it most in the market. Normally, there was a polite recoil when he walked past her, stepping aside, averted eyes, the tug of a child's arm. But now, people didn't even flinch. They didn't look at him at all. It was as if he had been erased alongside the friar. Elias noticed it too. He returned from town with bread that hadn't been shorted, coins that hadn't been overcounted. "They're afraid," he said, tearing off a piece and handing it to Jakob. "No," Jakob replied. "They're ashamed." And shaman-like fear was quiet. It didn't scream or tremble. It didn't riot in the streets. It retreated, hid. It waited for time to turn discomfort into tradition. Jakob wondered how long it would take. 2 days later, a small bundle was left at their doorstep. Not a warning this time. A gift, a basket of apples. Perfect ones, bright red, no worms, no bruises. The kind that made Elias raise his eyebrows and say, "Too good for us." There was no note, just a ribbon tied in the shape of a cross. Jakob didn't eat them. He placed the basket on the table and stared at it as if it were a riddle. Because it was. It asked, do they grieve him or themselves? Later that night, Elias spoke up. "I think they thought watching him die would make them feel safer." "It didn't," Jakob replied. "No," the boy agreed. "Now they just feel smaller." Jakob lit the fire and added wood. The sword lay beside him, wrapped in oilcloth, untouched. He hadn't sharpened it since Anselm, not out of protest, just inertia, a dullness of spirit that matched the steel. He pulled out the ledger, opened it to the page, ran a thumb over the name, over the line he had written, and then, in the narrow margin, he added another. The crowd did not clap, but I think they heard him. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters. The apples sat untouched, slowly ripening toward rot. He came just after dusk, barefoot and quiet. Jakob had been sharpening tools behind the cottage when he saw the figure, small boy, no more than 10, trudging along the edge of the tall grass with something clutched to his chest. For a heartbeat, Jakob thought it was a sack. Then he saw the ears, the trembling legs, a lamb, sickly, wheezing, barely alive. The boy stopped a few paces away, didn't speak, didn't flinch, just stood there as though he had arrived at a place his feet had chosen before his mind agreed. Jakob didn't move. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, man and child, death's representative and one small, stubborn plea. Then the boy knelt, set the lamb gently on the grass, and whispered, "They said you could save it." Jakob blinked. "Who said that?" The boy shrugged. "My uncle. He said you knew things. About pain." Jakob exhaled. Slow, careful. "Your uncle sent you here?" "No. He doesn't know I left." The boy looked down. The lamb's named Marta. She was born wrong. Jakob knelt, slowly, as if approaching a ghost. He reached out, gently lifting the lamb's chin. The creature was warm, but barely. breathing like it hurt. The kind of illness that didn't linger, it either passed or it didn't. Jakob didn't ask what the boy expected. Miracles weren't his trade. But he lifted the lamb, cradled it in his arms, and motioned toward the cottage. Elias was stunned when he entered. "Did we switch professions?" "She's called Marta," Jakob said, setting the lamb by the hearth. "See if you can do anything." The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, watching as Elias boiled water and crushed herbs with an intensity usually reserved for the dying. Jakob leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He had executed men for treason, for theft, for blasphemy, and now a child sat in his home, asking him to keep a lamb alive. The absurdity was not lost on him. "Do they really say that?" Jakob asked softly, after Elias had stepped outside for more leaves. "That I know things?" The boy nodded. "They say you see death before it comes." Jakob almost laughed. "I see it after," he said, "when it's too late." The boy didn't respond, just kept petting Marta, humming a song too old for someone so small. And somehow, impossibly, the lamb slept. Not peacefully, not deeply, but with that strange, uncertain calm that sometimes blesses creatures just before they recover, or just before they vanish. When the boy left hours later, carrying Marta wrapped in a blanket that once belonged to Jakob's sister, he didn't say thank you. He looked up at Jakob and said, "I think you're not just one thing." Jakob stood at the door long after they were gone. Not just one thing, not just a blade, not just a curse, not just the shadow of someone else's fear. He looked at his hands, the same hands that held rope and ink, and now softness. And for the first time in years, they did not feel dirty, just tired, just human. It wasn't really a tavernot anymore. Once, it had been a stable, then a cooper's barn, then, after a particularly good harvest and a few too many weddings, someone nailed up a crude sign and started calling it the Crooked Nail. It never got an official license. It never needed one. The ale was warm, the benches slanted, and the walls leaked whenever it rained. But it was safe, or at least familiar. Everyone went there, eventually. Even the magistrate's daughter, once disguised in a butcher's apron. Even the priest, muttering that God turned a blind eye on Thursdays. Everyone except Jakob, until one night he walked in. It was late. Too late for bread, too early for silence. The room was dim, lit only by firelight and the last dregs of a lute player's sorrow. Elias followed, unsure, trying to disappear into Jakob's shadow. They stood for a moment in the doorway, as if expecting someone to send them away. No one did, not because they were welcome, but because no one wanted to be the one to say no out loud. Jakob walked to the bar, slowly, deliberately. He didn't ask for wine, didn't demand a table. He placed 2 coins on the counter, one for ale, one for existing, and waited. The barkeep, a woman with hands like carved wood, poured the drink without a word. She did not look at him. He did not expect her to. Elias sat beside him, hands folded. He didn't drink, just watched. "What are we doing here?" he whispered. "Waiting," Jakob said. "For what?" "To see if the room breathes." And it did, eventually. The noise returned. Not loud, not fast, but enough. Dice clacked. A spoon stirred in a bowl. Someone muttered about taxes. Someone else sneezed. The room remembered its own rhythm. Jakob sipped the ale. It was bitter, but clean. Across the room, a man with a cobbler's apron stood and left. No explanation, just discomfort made mobile. Others stayed. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet, but it was. Permission. A crack in the door. Jakob didn't speak, not to anyone. He just drank, quietly, like a man in mourning. Not for the dead, for the years that might have gone differently. When they left, Elias glanced back at the door. It was still open. The fire still burned. "You think we'll go back?" he asked. Jakob didn't answer at first. Then, as the night wind rose to carry them home, he said, "I think maybe we already did." No one saw it fall. Jakob had been summoned early that morning for an inspection, small task, routine, the kind of grim maintenance that came with his role. The gallows had been used more in recent months. Too many trials, too many crimes that looked like poverty dressed up in sin. The wood groaned now with every breeze. He had sharpened the axe the night before, not for execution, for the gallows themselves. The ladder creaked under his weight. He tested the crossbeam, too soft, splintering. The nails had begun to lift like teeth loosening from a skull. The knot post had shifted an inch east, warped by sun and neglect. A good wind could undo it all. He stepped back. Just as he reached the base, it gave the beam cracked in a sound like dry thunder. The entire structure swayed, twisted, collapsed inward like a man dropping to his knees. Dust rose, a chain clanged. One of the steps snapped clean in half and landed inches from Jakob's foot. Elias, nearby with a coil of rope, let out a low whistle. That was close. Jakob didn't speak. He stared at the broken frame. The way the gallows had folded in on itself like an apology. Like exhaustion, they stood in silence. Eventually, the town clerk would write it off as wear. The wood, they'd say, had aged. The structure was due for repair. No foul play suspected. Certainly no divine message. But Jakob knew better. Structures fall when they've carried too much weight for too long. Later that day, as the sun pressed hard against the rooftops and flies hovered like memories around the scaffold ruins, Jakob found himself holding a hammer. Not to rebuild, but to dismantle, piece by piece, gently, as if disassembling a shrine. No one asked him to. He burned the remains behind his cottage, slowly, evenly, not as a cleansing, but as a burial. The ashes drifted east, toward the fields, toward the river, toward whatever place might still be quiet enough to forget. That night, Jakob didn't eat. He sat by the hearth with his hands folded. The gallows had never wept, never protested, but in its own collapse, it had spoken. It had said, "No more." Elias brought him water, didn't ask questions, just sat nearby, tying knots he would never need. And in the quiet that followed, Jakob whispered not to Elias, not to the room, not even to the ghosts, just to himself. It's not mercy if it breaks you first. It had been raining for 3 days. Not a storm, just the kind of slow, soaking rain that seems to have no beginning and no reason to stop. The kind that softens everything. Roads, rooftops, resolve. Jakob sat inside, staring at the mirror. It wasn't ornamental. Just a piece of polished glass, warped at the corners, framed in dented pewter. He had bought it years ago, not out of vanity, but necessity. Bloodstains don't always show in candlelight. The face must be checked. The hair, the collar. The illusion of detachment had to be immaculate. But today there was no execution, no audience, no reason. Still, he watched himself. Rain streaked the glass, made him look like he was drowning in slow motion. His face, no longer young. The beard that came in patchy. The eyes that didn't blink enough. He wondered if anyone else in the village ever looked at themselves this way. Not for grooming, not for reassurance, just observation, a ritual of recognition. Elias entered quietly, shaking off water. He carried kindling and a pouch of dried herbs. "You been sitting here long?" he asked. Jakob didn't answer. Elias followed his gaze, the mirror. "You don't look that bad," he offered. Jakob almost smiled. "You should have seen me when I believed in forgiveness." Silence. "Then, do you still write their names?" Jakob nodded. "Even the ones no one remembers, especially them." He kept the ledger under his bed now, not because of secrecy, but because he liked the idea of them resting nearby. As if memory could be a blanket. As if the names, fragile and fading, might warm him when nothing else would. "You ever forget one?" Elias asked. "No," Jakob said, too quickly. He was lying. There had been one. A girl, maybe 16, eyes like storm glass, hands tied too tightly. No crime that made sense. Something about a goat, or a prayer, or a birth that shouldn't have happened. He remembered her breath, shallow and brave. He remembered the weight of the sword, but her name gone. He had scoured the ledger, looked for it in every margin, woken from sleep, muttering vowels that didn't belong to any known language. He could see her face, but not call her back. And that, more than anything, felt like failure. Jakob stood, finally, turned away from the mirror. "The dead don't haunt me," he said, lighting the fire. "It's the ones I let vanish." Elias didn't reply. He added more wood to the flames. The room filled with smoke and quiet. Outside, the rain kept falling, erasing footprints, softening stone, making everything just a little harder to hold. There was a tree that never bloomed. It stood at the edge of a field once used for barley, long abandoned. Its bark was cracked like dry lips. Its limbs twisted northward, away from the sun. Even in spring, it refused to flower. A dull, silent shape against a sky that had forgotten what color was. Jakob visited it once a year. Elias came with him, though he never asked why. "Do you want me to wait here?" The boy offered, as always. Jakob nodded, yes. He walked the last few paces alone. The grass here was uneven, tripped over something deep beneath. Not rocks, not roots. Just time settling into itself. Jakob knelt. He did not pray. He spoke, softly, like telling a story to someone already asleep. "I thought forgetting would be kindness," he said. "But now I think it's the cruelest thing I've done." The tree said nothing. Trees rarely do. He placed a small stone at the base of the trunk, flat, round, white as bone. There were dozens now, scattered like teeth around the roots. Each one meant someone, a name too late, a detail lost, a face blurred by years and cowardice. This orchard, if it could be called that, was Jakob's shame garden. He had never buried a body here, not officially, but long ago, during a winter so brutal it cracked the mortar from the well, 2 corpses had gone unclaimed. No records, no relatives, just frostbitten limbs and silence. The pit had been shallow, the grief deeper. He never told the magistrate, never logged their names. They became the tree. He came back every year with another stone. Not always for the buried, sometimes for the forgotten. The girl whose name he lost, the boy who didn't cry, the man who apologized as he died. Sometimes he even left a stone for himself. Elias once asked if it was a superstition. Jakob didn't correct him. There are truths too fragile to say out loud, rituals that only hold power if no one laughs. Jakob rose, his knees protesting. He rested a hand on the bark. It was dry, warm, like old skin. "Next year," he said. Then he turned and walked back through the tall grass, past Elias, past the field, toward the cottage. He didn't look back. He never did, because some trees should never bloom, and some names are too heavy to carry more than once. He arrived unannounced, as priests often do when guilt rides beside them. Thin, older than he looked, wearing a robe that had once been white and now bore the yellowed hush of too many winters. He walked with a limp, claimed it came from a fall in the sacristy, though Jakob suspected a different sort of fall entirely. "Are you the one they speak of?" the priest asked, standing at the cottage gate. Jakob didn't answer. The question was too vague to merit a reply. "I've heard stories," the priest went on, "that you name the dead." "I write them," Jakob said. "Writing isn't naming." The priest stepped inside without invitation, his shoes leaving water on the floor. Elias watched from the back room, still as a shadow. "I've buried men," the priest said, "dozens. More, but I never gave them what I gave others." Jakob raised an eyebrow. "I withheld the rite," the priest confessed. "Refused last communion. No bell, no absolution, just earth. And now you want something from me," Jakob said flatly. "No," the priest said. "I want you to tell me if that was worse than what you do." The room went very still. Jakob moved to the hearth, stirred the embers with a poker. The fire cracked like brittle fingers. "You ask if silence is kinder than steel," he said. "If forgetting someone's soul is gentler than ending their breath." "Yes." Jakob looked at him, truly looked. The priest's eyes were bloodshot. His fingers trembled. He had not come to judge. He had come to be judged. "I killed them cleanly," Jakob said at last. "You let them rot in doubt." The priest nodded, as if expecting nothing else. He sat down, uninvited, and took off his gloves. "There was one," he murmured. "A woman. Her son had died, stealing bread. She spat at me when I denied her the burial prayer. Said I served a God who only spoke Latin and only listened to gold. Did you?" "For a long time," the priest said. "Yes." Jakob poured him wine-cheap, bitter, red as memory. The priest drank it without thanks. "Why come now?" "Because I thought," the priest said, "if anyone knew how to remember the unblessed, it would be the one who sees their faces last." Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere far off, a bell rang twice. Jakob lit another candle. He didn't forgive the priest. That wasn't his role. But he handed him a blank page from the ledger. "Write their names," he said. The priest looked down at the parchment. His lips moved silently. Then, slowly, he began to write. The quill scratched like footsteps on frost. The ink bled. And as he wrote, he wept. Elias brought bread. Jakob poured more wine. No blessings, no incense, just memory made visible. Names offered back to the world. And in that moment, Jakob saw something new. There were many ways to mourn, but the only mercy worth giving was to remember someone rightly, even if you were the last one who could. She couldn't have been older than 12. Thin arms, coal-streaked cheeks, hair tied back in a rag that had once been yellow. She showed up at Jakob's gate on the morning of an execution, boots caked in mud, eyes sharper than they should have been. "I want to see," she said. Jakob paused mid-step, one hand on the blade he was polishing. "See what?" "The hanging." Her voice didn't waver. Elias, nearby, looked up from binding rope. "She's just a kid. I'm not scared," she said. "And I won't tell." Jakob studied her. "Not for defiance, There was no rebellion in her posture. She was not daring him. She was asking, which, somehow, was worse. "Why?" he asked, quietly. She hesitated. Then, "My brother's up there." Jakob felt his chest shift. Not pain, not pity. Something older. A weight made of memory. "I want to be the last face he sees," she said. Jakob looked at the blade, then at her. "You won't like what you find," he said. She nodded. "I don't have to like it. I just have to be there." They didn't let her up on the platform, of course, but Jakob spoke to the bailiff, arranged for her to stand behind the cordon. Close enough to be seen. The crowd gathered, as it always did, early, anxious, half of them there for justice, the other half for the relief of watching someone else fall. The condemned, her brother, was young, too young, barely out of boyhood, eyes darting like a trapped bird. He stumbled once as they led him up. Jakob kept his hands steady. The girl stood just behind the last row, not crying, not shouting, just watching. Every breath held like a thread through her ribs. Jakob looked at the boy, then at her. Back again. He nodded. The boy saw her, and in that moment he stopped shaking. There was no speech, no last word, just a nod, just breath, just silence. Jakob did what he was asked to do, and when it was over, when the crowd had thinned and the coins had been paid, he found the girl sitting on the ground, legs folded, hands in her lap. "You saw," he said. She nodded. He offered her water. She drank it. Then, with the smallest voice he'd ever heard from someone still breathing, she said, "I didn't want him to die afraid." Jakob crouched beside her. He didn't. She looked up at him. Her eyes weren't dry, but they weren't broken either. "Thank you," she said. He almost told her not to, that this wasn't kindness, that this wasn't something to be thanked for. But she had already turned, walking back toward the village, toward the house that now had one less voice at the table. Jakob sat there long after she left. He did not clean the rope. He did not record the name. Instead, he pulled a scrap of parchment from his coat and wrote, slowly, deliberately. The girl looked back. That was enough. It was just past moonrise when Jakob noticed. The fire had burned low, the soup left untouched, the wind creeping under the door like an unwelcome thought. Elias was late, sometimes lost in the woods collecting herbs, or chatting with the blacksmith's son about splints and saddle rash. But never like this. Never without a word, Jakob waited. An hour passed. Then another. He lit the lantern, not because he was afraid, not yet, but because he had always promised Elias there would be light, if nothing else. The door creaked. The cottage sighed. He checked the drawer by the hearth empty. No note. No scribbled apology in Elias's blocky handwriting. No list of supplies. Jakob stood still for a long time, as if movement might confirm something he wasn't ready to name. Then he grabbed his coat. The road into the village was soft with fog. A moon hung low and sulking behind clouds. The fields whispered in the dark. He passed the well, the abandoned gallows stump, the fig tree with roots like questions. No sign. The tavern was quiet. The baker's dark. The healer's hut locked. Then just beyond the smithy Jakob saw something. A satchel, slumped against a stone. He knelt, opened it. Dried herbs, a folded cloth, a small wooden whistle carved into the shape of a lion. Elias's Jakob's hands tightened. He stood slowly, looking down the path that led toward the river, toward the old bridge, the one with boards too loose and stories too thick. He ran. The forest pressed in like a lung. Trees loomed. Every sound was a possibility. A twig snapped. A voice. An echo. The world too wide, too dark, too silent where it mattered. Then movement. A shape against a tree trunk. Slumped, breathing. Elias, the boy, blinked up at him, dazed. Mud smeared on his forehead. A torn sleeve, eyes glassy but alive. "I tried to go back," he whispered. Jakob dropped to his knees beside him. Back where? Before. The word landed like a stone in a still pond. Jakob looked at him, truly looked hand, saw what he had missed, the fatigue, the grief, the way Elias had begun to carry silence like a second spine. "I thought if I found the girl," Elias murmured, "the one who watched, maybe she'd remember something better than I do." Jakob said nothing. He wrapped the boy in his coat, pulled him close. Elias didn't cry. Not exactly, but his breathing hitched, once, then again, like the world was finally exhaling through him. Jakob held him until dawn. When the light returned, they walked home together. Slowly, without speaking, the satchel stayed on Jakob's shoulder. That night, Jakob didn't write in the ledger. He sat beside Elias by the fire, and instead of names, he whispered a story about a lamb once saved, about a rope that gave way before it could bite, about a crowd that forgot how to cheer, and about a boy who stayed, even when it would have been easier to vanish. Some professions begin at dawn with bells or roosters. Jakob's began with silence, not the kind found in churches or forests, but the thicker, kind like wool stuffed in the mouth of the world. A silence earned, paid for. He rose before the light. Always, even when there were no sentences to carry out. Even when the gallows had long been broken and the magistrate too hungover to remember justice. He rose, stretched his back until it cracked, and moved through the motions. He cleaned the basin. He stacked wood. He folded the cloth that wrapped the blade, even when it didn't need wrapping. Elias called it the tax. "Every morning you pay the tax," he'd said once, "so the rest of us don't have to." Jakob hadn't known how to respond. He'd wanted to say that it wasn't noble, that it wasn't sacrifice, that it was habit simple, brutal, and unimaginative, that sometimes routines become a way to avoid remembering you have a choice. But he didn't say any of that. He just kept folding the cloth. Outside, the village stirred. A rooster crowed. A cart creaked by. A woman's laugh floated across the air and vanished before it reached the window. Jakob stood at the threshold of the cottage, coffee in hand, watching the day arrive without asking his permission. He had not executed anyone in 6 weeks, not because crime had stopped, but because the town had started handling things internally. Discreet disappearances, quiet banishments, a suspicious fire or two. It wasn't justice, but it was distance, the kind of moral illusion that let men sleep better when the hangman was out of sight. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt excess, as if something inside him had built up like smoke behind a door, waiting for a spark. Elias noticed. He always did. "You need a trade," he said over stew one night. "A real one. Carpentry, candle making. You'd be good at it." Jakob raised an eyebrow. "Why candles?" Elias shrugged. "Because you already know how to burn things gently." They both laughed. Quietly, kindly. But the boy wasn't wrong. Jakob had spent his life perfecting precision. He could slice rope without nicking skin. He could measure a breath by the way it rattled in the throat. He could walk across a scaffold without a sound. He had given more clean ends than most men gave clean beginnings. And yet, He didn't know how to build, only how to end. That night, he walked to the stream behind the cottage and stared at his reflection. It wavered, like always. Rain from earlier in the week had made the water murky, but beneath the distortion, he saw a question beginning to form in the shape of his own face. What are you when no one needs you anymore? He did not have an answer, but he watched the water long enough to start wondering if maybe, just maybe, not being needed was the beginning of being something else. It came in the form of a letter, folded 4 times and pressed into Jakob's palm by a child with muddy shoes. The child said nothing, just handed it over and ran, as if the parchment might burn him if held too long. Jakob unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was elegant, steady, not afraid. I do not want to die in the presence of men who cannot look me in the eyes. The letter went on. Her name was Greta, widow of Karl Bohr, the stonemason. Her lungs were failing some sickness that made breathing sound like drowning in gravel. The healer had done what he could, which meant nothing. She had seen Jakob once, years ago, from a distance, a figure in black, unmoved while the world wept. She remembered that, and now she was asking him to come, not to kill her, to witness her dying. Jakob read the letter twice. Then he packed a small pouch of herbs, wrapped the blade out of reflex, not need, and walked to the edge of the village. Greta lived in a house made of old timber and older dust, the kind of place where grief had outlived wallpaper. She opened the door herself. She looked tired, thinner than the memory of her husband, whose name Jakob recalled from an old ledger, not for a crime, for a kindness. The man had once repaired the noose beam when no one else would come near it. I don't want prayers, she said, voice rasping like torn cloth. I didn't bring any, Jakob replied. She let him in. They sat in silence. No fire, just the crackle of a dying stove and the soft, rhythmic gasp of her breathing. I wrote you, she said, after a while, because the priest trembles when I cough. Jakob nodded. He understood. He asked if I'd repented, she continued, but I haven't done anything wrong. Unless loving someone longer than God allowed counts as heresy. It doesn't, Jakob said. Greta smiled. Her teeth were worn. You don't lie like a priest. I don't need to. Time passed. Jakob brewed tea with the herbs, bitter stuff, thick with sage and something darker. She drank it slowly, eyes closed. Her fingers curled inward with each swallow. When her breathing began to change, longer pauses between each inhale, she gripped his hand. He didn't pull away. You won't record this, will you? She asked. No, good. Let it just be what it is. She died an hour before dawn. No one cried. No bells rang. There was no audience, only the sound of rain starting gently on the roof. Jakob sat with her body until it cooled. Then he lit a single candle and whispered her name. Not for the ledger, just for himself. On the way home, he stopped by the fig tree and left a stone. Smaller than the others, smooth, warm from his hand. It didn't mean guilt, it meant witness. Not every death needs a sword, but every soul needs someone to stay. He never sat for a likeness. Not because he feared the vanity of it. Jakob had long stopped worrying about how he appeared to others, but because there was something obscene in the idea of making permanence out of a man whose job was endings. Still, the painter came, uninvited. A travelling Flemish portraitist, lean and grey and always chewing cloves. He showed up during Lent, claiming to be documenting the faces of real professions. Bakers, midwives, masons, and yes, executioners. I want to capture the truth of your eyes, he said. Jakob chuckled. You'll find only silence there. Even better, the painter replied. He offered coin, then more coin, then free grain sketches of Elias, should Jakob prefer to barter in tenderness. Jakob said no, politely, firmly, and yet the painter stayed. He watched from afar, at the market, near the well, once, from behind the church, as Jakob helped unload a cart of firewood. He didn't speak again, just stared, as if trying to memorize something no canvas could hold. Elias found it unnerving. He's trying to steal your soul. Jakob smiled. What makes you think I still have one? But he was thinking about it. Not the painting, he would never allow it, but the idea. What would a portrait of him look like? A man holding a sword with a hand that never clenched in rage. A brow furrowed, not from cruelty, but calculation. How high to swing, how quickly to end, how not to turn death into theatre. Would he be posed beside a scaffold, a ledger, a fire? Would anyone paint the rope burns on his palms, the creases in his boots from years of silent waiting? No one had ever drawn him, not even in ink. The only place Jakob existed outside. His body was in the margins of public records and the half-remembered tales of children who dared each other to touch his coat. There would be no statues, no plaques, no songs, but the painter, he didn't want honor. He wanted record. I paint the ones history forgets, he told Elias one day, uninvited at the cottage gate, because silence deserves a face. Jakob stood behind the door, listening. He didn't come out. That night, he took a piece of coal and drew a line on the wall. Just one, long and faint, near the fire, where no one would see it unless they looked too closely. It wasn't a face, it wasn't even a signature, but it was something. The next morning, the painter was gone. No sketches, no coins, no demands. Just a single canvas left on the doorstep, turned backward against the wind. Jakob didn't open it. He burned it without looking. Some truths are meant to live only in motion, and some men are not made to be still. It wasn't in any book. No parchment in the magistrate's chamber. No church decree nailed to the chapel door. No edict shouted by red-faced bailiffs in the square. But the law was real. It was the law that said Jakob couldn't speak at trials, couldn't object, couldn't question the evidence or refuse the sentence. His job was not to think, it was to follow, to end. Executioners were tools, not voices. But tools remember pressure. They remember the hand that holds them, the weight of every swing, and Jakob remembered too much. It came to a head one spring, when a boy was brought in from the edge of the district. A thief, they said, a repeat offender, no family, no coin, no defense. Jakob read the file. There was no theft recorded, only suspicion, no witnesses, only one man's word, alderman with debts and too many enemies. Jakob asked for a delay. Not a refusal, just a day. The magistrate laughed. This is not your concern, Nachrichter. Jakob stood still. He's 14, and already rotten, the man replied. Jakob left the office without a word. He didn't return the next morning, nor the morning after. The town waited. The gallows stayed empty. The sword remained sheathed. On the third day, Elias found Jakob in the woods, splitting wood with deliberate slowness, each blow landing like punctuation. I won't kill that boy, Jakob said. Elias didn't argue. But later, in the square, people noticed. The platform was swept, but not stained. The ropes were coiled, but untouched. The silence became noise. A murmur, then a question, then a fear. What happens when the man who ends death decides not to obey? The magistrate sent guards. Jakob didn't run. He opened the door, stepped aside, and let them read the summons. Then he handed them the sword. "If you need it, you use it," he said. They didn't, because none of them wanted the stain. None of them wanted to know what it felt like to stand above a child and feel the world hold its breath. The boy was spared. Officially, the trial was dismissed on a technicality. Privately, it was decided the executioner had earned a rest. Jakob was not thanked. He wasn't punished either. They needed him too much to pretend they didn't. But something had changed. He had crossed the line between shadow and resistance, and no one, not even the magistrate, could unsee that. That night, Elias brought the ledger. "There's no name to write," he said. Jakob took the quill anyway. In the corner of a blank page, he wrote, "Refused." One word. Enough. It began with a voice he didn't recognize. Old, worn, and half lost to the wind, like something remembered by a place, not a person. Jakob had gone to the river for water. The same river that once carried grain barges, now sluggish with the season's thaw. He was filling the pail when he heard it behind him. Your father was kinder than they said. Jakob turned. An old woman stood near the tree line, wrapped in grey, skin like folded paper, eyes too bright for her years. He didn't know her. She walked slowly toward him, favoring one leg, hands empty. "He used to bring soup," she said, "to my sister, after the frost took her legs." Jakob blinked. "You knew my father." She nodded. "He was the first one to carry my sister down to the river after her fever broke. Didn't speak much, but he cried once. When she gave him a flower, Jakob tried to picture it. A man he barely remembered, face half-built from fragments, the rest from silence. He hadn't spoken of his father in years, hadn't let himself try. "He told me," the woman said, "that it was worse to forget kindness than to remember pain." Jakob said nothing. The pail of water in his hand trembled slightly. "I thought you should know," she added. "You carry things well, but not all of it belongs to you." Then she turned and walked back into the trees, vanishing without hurry, like mist. Jakob stood there, pail in hand, listening to the wind. That night, he found a box beneath the floorboards. He hadn't opened it in over a decade. Inside, a handkerchief, a carving of a fox, and a ribbon yellowed, frayed, folded carefully. He didn't cry, but he did sit on the floor with the ribbon in his palm until the fire burned low. He added no name to the ledger, only a line. Some burdens are inherited, but not all of them have to be carried. In the morning, he walked to the river again, this time without a pail. Just the ribbon. He let it go, watched it float, and for the first time in years, he felt something loosen behind his ribs. Not release, not quite, but the suggestion of space. A breath returned. He began to take one day a week to do nothing. Not for prayer, not for penance, for absence. It was Elias's idea, first whispered after a long night of silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the rafters and the dull, wet crack of Jakob's joints. "You need a day," Elias said. "Just one. A day for what? For not being him." Jakob almost smiled. They never said executioner anymore. It had become too heavy, too dry in the mouth. A word that sucked air from the room like smoke from a snuffed candle. And so, once a week, Jakob stayed home. He didn't sharpen the sword, didn't touch the ledger, didn't walk the square or count the crows on the fig tree. Instead, he carved spoons. It started simply. the way tired men start things. A piece of ashwood, a dull blade, an idle hand. He made one, then two, then more, each slightly misshapen, each more refined than the last. No one ordered them. No one wanted them. They filled drawers, hung from nails, gathered in bowls like stories no one told. Ilias helped at first, then began making his own smaller, finer, better balanced. Jakob didn't mind. The boy's hands were steadier. By midsummer, they had a shelf full. Visitors rare as they were began to notice. "Do you sell these?" one asked. "No," Jakob said. "We remember with them." The visitor didn't ask what that meant. Jakob didn't explain. Because on those Sabbath days, the world softened. Bread rose without kneading. The wind felt less like warning, more like pause. Even the ghosts in the rafters seemed to settle their bones. He wore a different shirt, lighter, washed. He shaved sometimes. Other times, he let the stubble bloom. And once, toward evening, he whistled. Just a note. One clean sound into the air. Elias froze in the doorway. "You're allowed," he said, eventually, "to be more than the sum of what they needed you to be." Jakob nodded. He didn't always believe it, but he practiced, one spoon at a time. Each week, a Sabbath. Each Sabbath, a life not taken. A moment not surrendered. A life lived, quietly, fully, without cost, without a blade. He kept it out of sentiment, not necessity. One length of hemp rope, knotted the old way. Soft from age, darkened by oil and memory. It lived in the bottom drawer of a cabinet no one opened, folded beside a piece of red cloth and a rusted bell with no tongue. Jakob hadn't touched it in years, but he hadn't thrown it away either. Ilias found it by accident, looking for thread, maybe, or a spoon handle. The drawer slid open with that groan only disuse provides, and there it was coiled like a memory that refused to die quietly. Elias held it up, face unreadable, not afraid, just asking, "Why do you still have it?" Jakob was silent for a long time. Then, because one day I'll forget what it felt like to carry it. Ilias nodded slowly. "And you want to remember?" "I want to choose." He took the rope gently, as one might hold a relic or an injury, sat with it in his lap beside the fire, ran his fingers along the fibers, closed his eyes. He remembered the weight of it, the way it pressed into his coat when slung over a shoulder, the creak of it as it swung, the smells, wood, smoke, and something older, something like regret made physical. He remembered every hand it had bound, every breath that had passed beneath it. He didn't weep, he never did, but he placed the rope in the fire, not ceremonially, not defiantly, just completely. The flames caught it quickly, as if it had been waiting. The room filled with the scent of endings. Elias didn't speak. He just brought water, watched the embers, and waited. The next morning, Jakob opened the drawer, empty. He placed a spoon inside and closed it, quietly, with both hands. There was no mark on the floor, no ash left on the hearth. But for the first time in decades, the house no longer carried the smell of fear. She arrived near dusk, wrapped in a shawl the color of riverstone. Older than Elias, younger than Jakob, face lined not with age, but with deliberation. The kind of woman who spoke only when she had already imagined every version of your reply. She didn't give her name, didn't knock, just stood in the doorway as if she'd always been part of the place. Jakob looked up from the bench, a spoon half carved in his lap. Elias stood behind the hearth, fingers resting on a ladle. I was told you remember people, she said. Jakob nodded once. I do. She stepped inside. My brother died here, she said. Long ago, he stole bread. Maybe Jakob set the spoon down. I remember she didn't cry. That would have been too easy. Instead, she sat without being asked, folded her hands neatly, and stared at the wall like it owed her something. I didn't speak for him, she said. I was afraid they'd come for me too. Jakob didn't answer. There was time, she said, to stand up, to say no, and I didn't. Still, Jakob said nothing, because guilt doesn't need an audience. It needs a mirror. He was the kind one, she whispered. He used to steal apples, not for himself, but for our mother. I remember, Jakob said again. He cried when he saw the crowd, but not before. The woman closed her eyes. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It had edges, like glass. I thought you might hate us, she said. Jakob shook his head. I was you once. She opened her eyes. You're not now. No. What changed? He looked at Elias, then at the fire. Someone stayed. She nodded, just once, as if some part of her had expected that answer, as if the truth had arrived, finally, and she was not yet ready to carry it, but she would. She stood. Will you remember him longer than I did? Jakob met her eyes. Yes. She turned to go, stopped at the threshold, left a single coin on the table, not for payment, not for penance, just for balance. Jakob didn't touch it. He let it sit there as the fire dimmed, casting its soft round shadow onto the wood. Elias picked up the spoon and kept carving. Jakob watched the door, now empty. Some ghosts knock, others let themselves in, but only the rarest have the decency to say goodbye. It was not a dream. Jakob knew the difference. Dreams were fractured, wet-edged things that vanished by morning. This was something else, solid, unforgiving. He had fallen asleep by the fire, the spoon in his hand unfinished, head slumped forward, breath slow but uneven, and then warmth. A hand resting gently on his shoulder. He woke instantly, but no one was there. The cottage was quiet. The fire had dimmed. Elias was sleeping on the cot, one leg dangling over the edge, blanket bunched at his waist. Jakob didn't move. He knew that touch. Not the pressure, but the pause. The way it had lingered just long enough to say, "You're seen." He stood slowly, joints murmuring like old hinges. Walked to the door, opened it. The night outside was vast and breathless. No wind, no sound. Just the moon, swollen and watching, perched low above the fig tree. He stepped out barefoot, the earth cold against his soles. There was no one, and yet the feeling remained that someone had come, not to take, not to warn, to thank him. He looked toward the tree, the mound of earth beneath it, the stones like tiny, quiet gravestones, memories kept in shape. He whispered a name, not a specific one, just one of the many he had spoken aloud, more often than his own, then another, then a third. Each name like a prayer without promise, each one accepted into the night without echo. When he returned inside, the fire had almost gone out. He stirred it gently, coaxed flame from ash, placed one log carefully on top. Ilya stirred, everything all right. The boy murmured, not fully awake. Jakob didn't answer, not right away. He sat again, close enough to the heat, and placed his hand where the other had rested on his shoulder, repeating the shape, the weight, the stillness. Then he whispered, yes, and meant it. Not because the past had been mended, but because for the first time he felt its hand resting, not to push, but to steady. It wasn't his best work. The curve was off, the handle too thin. A splinter rose near the base, like a thorn left in haste. He'd carved it in late autumn, when the light came early but fled too soon, and the world had begun folding inward with the cold. He kept it anyway, not on the shelf, not in the drawer, on the table, always. Sometimes Elias would reach for it and pause, fingers brushing the edge before choosing a better made one. Other times, he would polish it with a cloth without being asked, not reverently, just attentively, like it mattered. Jakob never corrected him, because that spoon wasn't for eating. It was a memory of a day when nothing had happened, no sentence passed, no name added, just hours, just breath, just the quiet rebellion of making something useless and letting it remain. He had started carving it after reading an old letter, one written by a man long dead, who'd once said, "What we leave unfinished is often the most honest part of us." Jakob wasn't sure if he agreed, but the line stayed with him, the way certain faces do, the way a final glance from a condemned man can brand itself behind the eyes for years. And so the spoon remained, not hidden, not offered, just there. One day, a traveler came through, a woman with a voice like stone and a child who wouldn't stop asking questions. She saw the spoon, picked it up, turned it in her hand. "This one's broken," the child said. The woman smiled, soft but knowing. "No," she replied. "This one tells the truth." They left without buying anything. Jakob sat at the table that night and stared at the spoon. Then, slowly, he picked up the knife, not to fix it, to mark it, a single line down the handle, deep enough to feel, barely visible, a scar, a signature, or maybe both. He set it down and let it remain, unfinished, because some endings should not be corrected, and some stories are most honest when they're left a little rough around the edge. He was 10, maybe 11, too old to be babied, too young to be truly blamed. He stood at the edge of Jakob's path just past the broken fence, just shy of the herb garden barefoot and chewing the inside of his cheek like it owed him something. Elias saw him first. "There's a boy," he said, not looking up from the water pot. "Been there for an hour." Jakob stepped outside. Slowly, no coat, no blade. The boy didn't run. "Are you the hangman?" he asked. Jakob nodded. "I need to know if my father screamed." A pause. A long one. Jakob's mind searched the ledgers not by name, but by shape, by posture, by the trembling of knees, by the angle of the head before the fall. He remembered. "No," he said quietly. He didn't. The boy nodded, once, sharply, as if bracing for something worse, then unsure what to do when it didn't arrive. Did he look scared? Jakob sat on the step. He looked like someone who knew he wouldn't be believed. The boy swallowed hard. "They say he killed a man, but he didn't. He just took a horse to find me." Jakob didn't offer comfort, didn't say, "I'm sorry." That would have been dishonest. There are sorrows too large to be made smaller with sound. Instead, he asked, "What do you want from me?" The boy looked down. "I want to remember him right." Jakob reached beside him, picked up a stick, began drawing in the dirt line's arcs, nothing coherent. "You remember him by what he carried, not by how he fell." The boy looked up. "You mean the horse?" "I mean you." The boy blinked, then turned, then walked back toward the village, legs stiff, with the kind of dignity only children can pull off while holding tears in their throat. Jakob didn't call after him, didn't watch him vanish. He just kept drawing. When Elias brought him tea, he pointed to the ground. "What's that?" Jakob looked down. It was a face, Not a real one, just suggestion. Ashes, lines, shadow. Someone who didn't scream, he said. Elias placed the tea beside him, left the drawing untouched. By morning, the wind had erased it. But Jakob remembered, because sometimes forgiveness isn't given, it's asked for. By someone too young to understand the question, yet brave enough to wait for the answer. He had tried 3 times to light it. The wick was dry, the air still. No draft, no damp, no reason it shouldn't have caught. But each time Jakob touched flame to thread, it flared, then vanished like something swallowing light before it could take hold. It wasn't a new candle, just one he hadn't used before, short, tapered, made from leftover tallow, poured into a mold shaped like a thumbprint. It had been meant for the ledger, a small light for small names. But tonight it refused. Elias noticed. Need another. Jakob shook his head. This one's fine. He tried again. The flame danced for a moment, then died. He stared at it, not frustrated, not angry, just curious. I don't think it wants to be remembered, Elias said, half joking. Jakob considered that. What if some memories burn us more than they guide us? Elias sat across from him. Then maybe they're not ready. Jakob nodded. He set the candle aside, pulled another from the drawer. This one caught instantly steady, warm, obedient. The kind of flame you could write under. He opened the ledger. There were only a few pages left now, thin with years, heavy with names. Most of them forgotten by the world, but kept here etched in ink and the careful rhythm of sorrow. He added a new one, slowly, not because it was required, not because it had been sanctioned, just because someone should. And in the margin, beside the name, he wrote, "The candle would not light, but I remembered anyway." When he closed the book, Elias was asleep in the chair, arms folded, face tilted toward the glow. Jakob reached for the first candle, the stubborn one, held it in his palm. The wax was softening, the wick still intact. He didn't try again. He let it remain unlit. A memory that refused illumination. Not all forgiveness needs fire. Some is made in darkness, quiet, whole, and waiting. It had been scratched from the record. Jakob found the gap while revisiting an old page, flipping through brittle parchment that smelled of smoke and time. A name had once lived there. He could see the ghost of it, the indent of ink long scraped away. Someone had taken a blade to the word, carved it out of memory like rot from fruit. He traced the wound with his thumb. Elias leaned over his shoulder. "That's deliberate," Jakob nodded. "Why?" "To protect the living, or shame the dead." They both knew it wasn't uncommon. Certain names became too dangerous, too political, too sacred. The town had a long memory and a short tolerance. Sometimes the past was erased to make the future simpler. But Jakob didn't believe in clean slates. He believed in soil, and the way it held everything: seeds, bones, secrets, no matter how carefully you tried to bury them. That night, he sat at the fire with a blank scrap of paper. He didn't rewrite the name. He didn't know it. But he wrote around it, described the day, the weather, the tilt of the condemned's head, the hush before the act, the color of the shoes, the way a child in the crowd had covered their ears too late. He wrote the echoes, and at the top of the page, where a name should have gone, he drew a single, looping question mark. Elias watched him, quiet. "You're giving them shape without a face," he said. Jakob looked up. Sometimes that's all history allows. The paper didn't go in the ledger. It stayed near the hearth, folded, tucked inside a book of Psalms that neither of them read but both respected, a sacred space for things unspoken. Over the years, more pages joined it. Not names, just fragments, half-truths, memories, unfinished sentences. It became a kind of second ledger, a home for those the world refused to carry. Jakob never gave it a title, but once, on a quiet morning, Elias added 3 words to the inside cover. For the nearly forgotten, Jakob left it there, because some forgiveness can only begin when you admit you were never meant to forget. It was the one night a year the town pretended it didn't remember him. The festival of St. Ulrich, candles in every window, bread for the poor, laughter like wine spilling down the cobblestones, children carrying paper lanterns shaped like stars, bells, birds. One year, someone made a lion with eyes that flickered red. Elias loved that one. They never invited Jakob. Officially, there were no invitations. Everyone was expected. But unofficially, quietly, his absence was part of the ritual. His house, like death itself, stayed just outside the glow. He never protested, not once, but this year he walked into the square. Not alone. Elias had built a lantern, clumsy, bright, shaped like a spoon. When Jakob asked why, Elias just grinned and said, "Because it carries." They walked side by side. No cloaks, no masks, no apologies. Children stopped whispering. Adults kept their voices soft, careful not to startle the moment. No one spoke to them, but no one stepped aside. Jakob stood near the fountain, watching the sky flicker with lights. Not stars, paper flames set adrift on string and hope. He remembered the first time he had seen one from his window, years ago, and mistook it for a soul trying to return. Now, he knew better. Souls don't float, but stories do. A girl passed by with a lantern shaped like a dove. She paused, looked up at Jakob. Didn't flinch. "Did you make one?" she asked. He shook his head. "No." She reached into her satchel and handed him a spare. Simple, round, yellow. "Everyone should carry something," she said, then ran off before he could reply. He held it awkwardly, as if it might scold him. Elias leaned in. "You going to light it?" "I don't know how. Doesn't matter," Elias said. "Just hold it." So he did. The night continued. Music rose and fell like breath. A dog barked. Someone dropped a tray of sweets and swore loud enough to make 3 priests cross themselves. Jakob stood there, still, steady, a man with a lantern and a past. And slowly, very slowly, the circle widened. Someone nodded at him. Someone offered a smile, not generous, not wide, but real. And in the quiet between songs, someone sang a verse about mercy that didn't sound like it came from a pulpit. When Jakob walked home, the lantern still burned. He didn't hang it. He placed it in the window. Not for light, for witness. Because some forgiveness doesn't come from being forgiven. It comes from being allowed to stay. He had started it a dozen times. Sometimes on parchment, sometimes in his head. It had no address, only a name, Dorothea. She had been gone longer than she'd been present. His sister, the one who used to tie ribbons in his hair and sing lullabies off-key. The one who had run from Entredlingen long before the town could decide what to make of her. Jakob didn't know where she'd gone, or if she'd lived, but some part of him had carried her all this time. The guilt, mostly, because she had begged him not to take the post. Not with words, just in the way she looked at him when their uncle died. That soft, wild stare that said, "Don't become something you'll have to survive every day of your life." And he had become it, survived it, forgotten how not to. He began the letter late one night, with Elias already asleep, the fire low, the sword long since retired to its place above the doorknot, as threat, not as tool, just relic. Dorothea, you were right, and I don't think that means I was wrong. He paused. Started again, Dorothea. I remember the day you left. The bread was burnt, and the sky was red, and no one knew where you'd go. I used to resent you for that. Now I wonder if I just wanted to be the one who left first. He crossed it out. Started again. Dorothea, there are names I carry, some carved in bone, some lighter than breath, but yours is the only one that feels like a door I never opened. This time, he didn't cross it out. He kept writing, slowly, carefully, as if the letter would be read by the air, or the walls, or the memory of a sibling who may have forgiven him already, or may have forgotten him entirely. He ended it simply. If you remember me, remember that I tried, even when I became the thing you feared. I tried. He didn't seal the letter, didn't hide it, just folded it, placed it beneath the lantern from the festival, still faintly yellow, still intact, and left it there, in case someone ever came looking, because some forgiveness isn't about being answered. It's about knowing, finally, that you have the right to ask. The frost came early that year, not with violence, but with insistence creeping into the corners of the windows, stiffening the water in the pails, settling like an old truth into Jakob's knees. For the first time in a decade, there was no execution scheduled for winter, no condemned waiting in the jail, no petitions, no hushed visits from magistrates with ink-stained hands and hearts full of hesitation. The sword remained untouched, still above the door, still wrapped in cloth, but quieter now, no longer humming with expectation. Jakob noticed the difference immediately. So did the town. People walked more slowly past the cottage, not from fear, from curiosity, as if waiting to see what a man like him became when he was no longer asked to perform his terrible devotion. He became quiet. He became present. He fed the chickens with gentler hands, carved spoons with softer curves, built a shelf for Ilias's growing collection of herbal texts and bone fragments, cleaned the ledger, page by page, as if it was scripture. But most of all he listened, to the sound of snow melting on the roof, to the creak of the old fig tree, empty of leaves but full of memory, to Elias reading aloud from a book of Old Norse proverbs, laughing at ones he didn't understand. Jakob felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. Stillness, not the stillness of death, not the waiting kind, but the kind that comes when the world doesn't need anything from you, not answers, not punishment, not precision, just breath. One evening, he sat by the fire with a spoon half finished in his hand and said aloud, "I think I don't hate winter anymore." Elias looked up, surprised. "Why not?" "Because it gives me nothing to do," Jakob said. "And for the first time, I don't feel useless." They didn't speak after that, just let the fire warm the space between them. The sword stayed on the wall, waiting, perhaps, but not demanding. Jakob watched the snow pile against the door and felt no dread, just the quiet grace of a man whose hands had finally been allowed to rest. And in that rest, forgiveness began to bloom, not from others, from himself. It was supposed to be a simple loaf, flour, water, salt, and time, nothing more. But that morning, as Jakob pulled the dough from the hearth, he saw what Elias had meant when he'd said, "Let it rest longer." The loaf had risen past the edge of the pan, spilled out slightly over the sides, cracked along the top like the skin of a long-held secret. Jakob stared at it for a while before speaking. "It's proud," he said. Elias grinned. It's overproofed. Like me, Jakob muttered. They laughed. Not hard, not long, but together. It wasn't the first time Jakob had baked, but it was the first time he'd done it without need. He hadn't bartered for grain, hadn't measured rations, hadn't done it for survival, just for the sake of doing. He cut the loaf. Steam rose like forgiveness. The inside was soft, too soft. The crust flaked unevenly. They ate it anyway. This isn't bread, Elias said with his mouth full. It's memory. Jakob raised an eyebrow. Memory tastes like disappointment. Sometimes, Elias said, but it still feeds you. They ate the whole thing before noon. Later that day, a neighbor passed by. Not close enough to knock, but close enough to see smoke from the chimney. She paused, lifted her hand, then lowered it. Jakob saw her. He didn't wave, but he nodded. She hesitated, then nodded back. A week later, she sent flour. No note, just a sack, tied at the top with a string the color of dried lavender. Jakob made another loaf. This one smaller, tighter. It split perfectly at the top. He left half of it at her doorstep, still warm. And suddenly, the winter felt less like waiting and more like becoming. A man who once measured rope was now measuring yeast. A man who once silenced breath was now kneading air into dough. Not to erase what had been, but to remember differently, because even overproofed bread can be sweet. And even old hands, if given the chance, will choose to nourish. He hadn't had it in weeks. The dream, the one that came like a tide at the edge of sleep, where faces turned without mouths, where ropes swayed from trees that had no branches, where Jakob's hands were always wet but he could never see with what. It had been part of him for so long, he hadn't realized its absence until that night. He woke just before dawn, still, whole, unscreaming. The room was quiet. Elias breathing softly in the cot. The coals in the hearth low but still alive. The sword above the door unmoved. The air didn't carry weight, just cold. He sat up slowly, unsure what had changed. And then he remembered. In the dream, there had been no gallows, only snow, endless, soft, falling snow. He had been walking, not chased, not beckoned, just moving, step by step. And beside him, someone small, a child, maybe, or the memory of one. Not Elias, not a ghost, just a presence. No rope, no blade, just footsteps, just snow and quiet. He rose, wrapped himself in his oldest coat, and stepped outside. The ground was frozen, the moon still visible. The trees stood like sentries, their silence now familiar. He walked to the fig tree, placed a hand on the bark. "I think," he whispered, "I've run out of things to bury." He didn't cry. There was nothing left to leak from the eyes. But something inside him softened, the way snow does when touched by light. Behind him, he heard Elias stir inside the cottage. The scrape of a chair, the rustle of a blanket. He didn't turn around. He stayed there, one hand on the tree, watching his breath rise. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he owed the dead an apology. He simply wished them rest. As he had begun, finally, to wish it for himself. And maybe just maybe dreams that don't scream are dreams that stay. It came without warning. Sealed in red, bearing the stamp of Nördlingen's town council, though the wax was cracked and the paper frayed, as if the message itself had second thoughts. Jakob didn't open it immediately. He held it by the hearth, weighing its intention. Letters from the magistrate were never casual. They carried obligation like old debt, even in winter. Elias entered, cheeks pink from the cold, fingers gripping a bundle of herbs. "What's that?" "An invitation," Jakob said, though he hadn't read it yet. Elias raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "No," Jakob admitted. He opened it. The script was formal, familiar, phrased with all the grace of legal discomfort. "As the year turns and the snows begin to lift, we write to extend an invitation to join the spring reckoning, a gathering of civic voices to discuss reforms in matters of capital justice. Your presence is requested not for duty, but for memory." Jakob read it twice. Then a third time, he laughed right, short, not unkind. "What is it?" Elias asked. "They want me to speak," Jakob said, "not swing." Elias was quiet. "Then you'll go." Jakob didn't answer. Instead, he laid the letter flat on the table, poured tea, stirred without sipping. In the corner, the sword hung mute, distant, irrelevant. The last time the magistrate had summoned him in spring, it had been to end a man whose only crime was arguing too well. A man whose last words had been, "Do not confuse silence with agreement." Jakob still heard that line when the wind moved right. Now they wanted him to share, not blade, not verdict, voice. He took a long sip of tea, warm, slightly bitter. "Good, I think I might," he said. "Speak," Jakob nodded. "They think the work ends with death," he said. "Maybe it's time they learn what comes after." Elias smiled. "You'll terrify them." "Only a little," Jakob said. He placed the letter back in the envelope, set it beside the ledger, and for the first time in years, he felt something strange settle in his chest. Not dread, not purpose, possibility, a reckoning where the rope would stay coiled, and the executioner would be allowed to say, "I remember everything, and that is why we must change." It was the last freeze of the season. The pond near the outer field had been glass for weeks, its surface thick with frost, edges feathered with reeds turned silver. Children had walked it early on, cautiously, then boldly. Even Elias had skated once, slipping once so dramatically he'd called it a death rehearsal. Jakob hadn't stepped on it, not yet. But this morning, as the sun crept slow and sideways over the trees, he walked there alone. No boots, just old shoes and the stubborn resolve of someone who needed to know if the world still held. The air cracked with cold. His breath came slow, visible. He stepped onto the ice, and it held. Not a groan, not a creak, just stillness deep, cold, complete. He walked a few paces, then more, arms loose, not testing balance, just trusting it. At the center of the pond, he stopped, closed his eyes, listened. The world was utterly silent. No birds yet, no carts, no sound of work, only the sound of Jakob's own heart, steady. The body of a man who had once been the final breath for hundreds, now alone in the stillness unneeded, unasked. He remembered something Dorothea had said once, long ago. When the earth stops asking you for blood, what will you give it instead? He didn't have an answer then, but maybe this was it. A walk across frozen water, a body no longer feared, a silence that did not punish, a life still carrying weight but differently now, evenly. He opened his eyes, took one more step. Still, the ice held, and in that moment, he realized something he had never dared name. He was not waiting to die anymore. He was living, slowly, gently, on top of something fragile, yes, but he was no longer breaking it. He turned back toward shore, and the ice, like the life he'd rebuilt, did not betray him. It simply held. It happened quietly, No proclamation, no ceremony, no public vote. Someone simply called him by his name. Jakob, not Nakrektor, not Hangman, not the one who... just Jakob. It came from a child, which made it stranger. He had been carrying firewood into the chapel courtyard, part of the new arrangements. Now that he had been asked to consult on the town's criminal proceedings, not sentencing, not swinging, just advising, remembering, explaining what a rope meant, not how it worked. The child had been playing with chalk, drawing crooked lines in the dirt. "Hello, Jakob," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He paused. She didn't. He nodded, quietly, carefully, and in that single syllable, he felt more than he had in years of rope and ritual. Ilias noticed, of course. He always did. Later that evening, they sat by the fire, bread half-eaten, spoon half-carved. Quiet. She said your name, Elias said. "I know. You okay?" Jakob didn't answer right away. Then it felt like a bell had rung that no one realized was still hanging. Elias smiled. "Maybe they're ready." Jakob shook his head. "No, but maybe I am." He looked toward the window. The night outside was soft, wrapped in the last hush of winter's breath. No crows, no watchmen, no sentences waiting to be signed. Jakob, not a title, not a warning, not a role wrapped in silence and suspicion. Just a man, with a name. And for the first time in decades, the sound of it didn't sting. It soothed. Because being remembered as something other than your worst day is its own kind of resurrection. It arrived, wrapped in linen, not for ceremony, just protection. Jakob had carved it weeks before, from walnut wood so dark it shimmered like coal in the sun. A gift, a gamble. He had not intended to send it. But one morning, after reading another request from the mayor Pollitt, efficient, and asking yet again for a statement on appropriate thresholds of violence, Jakob simply wrapped the spoon and walked it to the town hall himself. He didn't leave a note. He left it on the mayor's desk, nodded to the clerk, and walked out. It was not the kind of town where executioners gave gifts. And yet, the next time Jakob passed through the square, the mayor was there, publicly, deliberately, using the spoon to stir his morning porridge from the communal pot during market blessing. Jakob said nothing. The mayor looked up. Their eyes met. He tapped the spoon once on the rim of the pot and said, "Balanced." Jakob nodded, just once, and moved on. He didn't care for politics, but he understood symbolism. A spoon, after all, was not just a tool. It was a vessel. It carried what sustained you, or what burned you. It could nourish or scald. And in the right hands, it was an offering of mercy in a world so often obsessed with sharpness. Elias was unimpressed. "You know they'll turn it into a metaphor. Let them," Jakob said. "It'll be in the sermons by next week. He who carves a spoon from the tree of gallows shall be first at the table." Jakob chuckled. "Then I'll make more. Start a revolution. You'll need better wood. I have time." The spoon never returned, but Jakob began finding his carvings in unexpected places. A ladle in the healer's tent, a measuring spoon at the bakery, a flat, shallow scoop in the chapel, used to measure salt for the blessing of the dead. No one spoke of them, but they were used. Every day Jakob didn't mark them. He didn't have to. Each one bore the same truth. You can build from what once destroyed. You can feed from what once took. You can change your legacy, not by forgetting what your hands have done, but by asking them to do something more. It had taken years. Not of filling, but of resisting the urge to fill. To write reflexively, to name reflexively. There had been times when Jakob opened the book and stared at the last page, hand poised, breath steady, and then closed it again. But today felt different. Not because someone had died, because no one had. And that, too, deserved a place in the record. He opened the ledger with hands that no longer shook. The ink bottle was old, half clotted at the rim. The quill had been carved by Elias, its handle polished by time and touch. Jakob dipped the nib once, paused, then wrote, "Today, no one begged, no one screamed, no one ran. Today, the rope remained coiled, the blade remained silent. Today, the town remembered mercy." He signed it, not with his title, not even with his full name, just J. He closed the book, ran a hand over its cover, and then stood, slowly, and placed it back on the shelf where it belonged. Between the psalter and the journal where Elias sketched his bones and flowers and thoughts too restless to speak aloud. "What did you write?" Elias asked from the doorway. "The truth. Will they read it?" Jakob shrugged. "Maybe one day. Will they believe it?" "I don't care." Elias stepped inside, leaned against the table. "You going to start a new one?" Jakob looked toward the shelf. "No." "Why not?" "Because some ledgers end." They sat for a while, saying nothing. The fire popped softly. Outside, the wind moved through the fig tree older now, its roots tangled around stone and memory. A tree that had once watched men die now stood in a world where, at least today, no one had to. Jakob closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, in arrival, because to finish the book, and not need to start another, was a kind of peace he had never dared write down. It was tucked behind the hearth. Old canvas, cracked frame, dust so thick it had grown its own silence. Elias found it while cleaning, cursing the mouse nest he'd stirred up with the broom. He pulled it out, squinting. "Didn't know we had this." Jakob didn't answer. He knew what it was. The portrait, the one the painter had left all those years ago. He had never looked at it. Not truly. Had burned the first one on the doorstep. Or so he thought. But here it was, unburned, just, hidden. Elias set it on the table, wiped it off with a cloth, looked at Jakob carefully. "You want me to leave?" Jakob shook his head. "No." He sat. The fire cracked. The canvas leaned slightly. And Jakob, with the softness of someone bracing for memory, turned it around. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a likeness. There was no face. Just a man, seen from behind, cloaked in a long coat, a sword slung across his back like a burden, standing before a tree bear, bending old. The sky behind him was colorless. But it wasn't sad. It was quiet. Still, the kind of stillness that came not from despair, but from endurance, from choice, from having stayed. Elias stepped closer. "It's you," he said. Jakob nodded. "But it could be anyone." Jakob nodded again. "Do you want to hang it?" Jakob looked at the wall, then at the painting, then at the space beside the door where the sword had once hung. No, he leaned it gently against the table leg, left it there, visible, present, but not venerated. Because this wasn't about glory, it was about truth. A man who turned his back on execution, but never on the memory of what it had cost. He stood, stretched, and felt no weight on his back. Not today, and that too was enough. It had rusted in place, not from disuse, but from refusal. The town's old execution bell once rung to mark the final walk, the final breath. The final silence still hung above the jail, weathered and crooked, its rope long rotted, its yoke stiff with age. No one had touched it in years. It remained not as threat, but as memory. Jakob passed it on his way into town one morning, a small bag of herbs in one hand, a spoon for the apothecary in the other. He paused. The bell didn't move. He looked up at it, not with fear, not with reverence, just the way one looks at an old scar faded, but never gone. Elias caught up to him, slightly out of breath. "You okay?" Jakob nodded. "Do you think it'll ever ring again?" Elias looked at the iron shape, dark against the pale morning sky. "Not for you," Jakob smiled faintly. "Not for anyone, I hope." Elias shrugged. "Or maybe it should." "For beginnings." Jakob looked at him, puzzled. Elias grinned. "Same bell, different meaning. A bell for what? For mercy. For when we choose to let someone live." Jakob considered that. A bell for forgiveness. A bell for restraint. A bell, Elias added, for staying your hand. They both stared at it, then kept walking. Behind them, the bell remained silent, but not forgotten. It stood now not as a warning, but as a question. What does it mean to have the power to destroy, and choose not to? Jakob didn't answer aloud, but in the ledger of his bones, he wrote it down. Let the bell rust. Let the rope rot. Let the people forget how it sounded, but never forget why we stopped. He still kept it near the door. The coat, black, thick, weighted in every sense. Wool stitched with wear, hem frayed from decades of mud, blood, ash. He had mended it so many times, the patches told a fuller story than the fabric. It had once made him disappear into shadow. Now it just hung there. He hadn't worn it in nearly 2 winters, not since the sword came down from the wall, not since people began calling him Jakob without hesitation, not since the air around his home had begun to carry something other than suspicion. But he hadn't given it away, and he hadn't buried it, because some things you don't discard. You let them wait until they no longer recognize you. One evening, as snow pressed against the windows and the wind meandered without malice, Jakob stood before it again, reached out, touched the collar. It was cold, but no colder than the past. He slipped it on, not as armor, as memory. The weight was familiar, but his shoulders no longer slouched beneath it. His spine no longer folded in anticipation of what must be done. The coat didn't claim him. It just fit him, like a chapter that no longer demanded to be read aloud. He walked outside. Elias followed a few steps behind, saying nothing, just watching. Jakob walked the perimeter of the cottage, checked the woodpile, stood at the edge of the field where the fig tree sat, skeletal and strong, watched the snow gather in its branches. Then he returned, hung the coat gently, did not turn to face Elias right away. When he did, his eyes were calm. "You're sure?" Elias asked. Jakob nodded. That was the last time. Elias didn't ask what he meant. He knew, and so the coat remained still near the door, but quiet now, no longer waiting to be worn, no longer hiding a man who had once been a sentence made flesh, just fabric, just thread, and behind it, a man who had learned to live with the cold, not because he stopped fearing it, but because he no longer mistook it for purpose. It appeared one morning on the table, wrapped in plain linen, tied with a blue ribbon, neither festive nor somber, just precise. Jakob found it before the hearth had been lit, before Elias had risen, before the chickens began their morning negotiations with the sun. No note, no name, just wait. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a knife, not for killing, a carving knife, walnut handle, smooth and oiled, blade narrow, curved perfectly not for severing flesh, but for shaping wood. It was better than any tool he owned. He turned it over in his hands, felt its balance, the quiet promise of its steel. Whoever had made it knew him, knew what he did now, not what he had done. Elias found him an hour later, still sitting with it. "You okay?" Jakob held the knife up. "No one's ever given me something without asking something back." Elias sat. "Maybe they are. Maybe they already took what they needed." Jakob set the knife down gently. He didn't ask who it was from. There were only a few people who might have known the exact tension of his grip, the angle of his thumb when he shaved the edge of a spoon's bowl. He didn't need to name them. Some gifts aren't for gratitude, they're for witness. He used the knife that afternoon. The first cut was clean, not sharp in the way blades usually are. This one whispered through the wood, like it had been waiting to move, like it understood what needed doing. Jakob smiled, a rare, full one. Elias watched from the doorway, quiet, and in the light of a slow, greying day, they did not speak of the gift again. But the spoon it made smaller than most, curved like a question mark, sat on the windowsill for the rest of that winter, not to be used, just to be seen. Because sometimes the right knife says, "I see what your hands have carried, and also, I believe they can still create." They buried the baker in late February. Old Hildebrand, stoop-backed, flower-covered, always humming tunelessly. A fixture in the town, like the cracked stones in the chapel floor. Gone in his sleep, they said. Bread rising in the hearth when they found him. Jakob hadn't planned to go. Funerals were places for those with untarnished grief, and while no one forbade him, the understanding had always been, "Your mourning belongs elsewhere." But Elias laid out his coat, not the black one. The one with the worn cuffs and the pocket that always smelled faintly of cedar. "You should go," Elias said. Jakob didn't argue. He walked to the chapel slowly, arriving last. The pews were full. People stood in the back, murmuring, hats in hand. The air smelled of wax and wheat. He stayed at the threshold, watched, listened. The priest spoke gently of generosity, of warmth, of the thousands of loaves Hildebrand had made without ever counting who they fed. He gave because he could, the priest said, and because he knew hunger. Jakob's eyes flicked to the coffin. Plain pine, simple, honest. He remembered the first time Hildebrand had looked him in the eye, after a hanging, years ago. Offered him a loaf, no words, just bread, slightly burnt at the edges, still warm. Jakob had accepted it with both hands. He had never spoken to Hildebrand again, but he'd eaten every crumb. Now, standing in the chapel's shadow, he felt something catch in his throat. Not sorrow, not regret, recognition. When the service ended, people filtered out slowly. Some glanced at him, most didn't. Then the mayor stepped past, paused, and without drama, without fanfare, placed a hand on Jakob's shoulder. A gesture, not of absolution, but of place. Jakob nodded, walked back home in silence. When he arrived, he opened the ledger one last time, not to write a name, but to tear out a page. A blank one. He folded it. Wrote only this: "Some people feed the world quietly. Others learn, in time, to do the same." He placed it beside the carving knife, and let the day end without speaking. Because sometimes the loudest mourning is the kind that chooses not to interrupt. It happened sometime after midnight. Jakob had fed it before bed to logs, careful placement, the way he'd done for years. Not out of ritual, but respect. Fires were like memory, easily smothered, easily ignored, but they gave warmth if you let them breathe. But this one faded differently, not with smoke, not with struggle, just dimming, as though it had decided it was time. Jakob noticed it in his sleep, not the cold, but the quiet. That particular silence when even the smallest crackle has stilled. He rose, blanket around his shoulders, feet soft on the wooden floor. The coals were red, low, curling like sighs. He didn't reach for more wood. He sat before them instead. Elias stirred in the loft above, rolled over, muttered something that might have been Jakob's name or the tail end of a dream. Jakob closed his eyes, thought of all the fires he had known, the ones he'd stood beside with trembling hands, the ones that waited at the edge of rope, the ones that burned too fast after the funeral pyres of unnamed dead, the hearths of condemned cottages. He thought of how many nights he'd watched flame, not for comfort, but for proof that something was still burning, still fighting, still present in the face of endings, and now this a fire that bowed out without performance. He watched until the last ember dimmed. The room cooled, the air settled like dust. He didn't light it again, not out of sadness, out of trust. Elias would wake soon, and when he did, the fire would return not with panic, not with need, but with choice. Jakob returned to bed, blankets still around his shoulders, the smell of ash still on his skin, and as he drifted toward sleep, he realized this is how a life leaves, too. Not always in flame, sometimes in softness, in having done enough, burned long enough, given enough heat to the world, to rest, finally, without apology. Sunlight came gently, no fanfare, no harsh light, just the soft glow of morning slipping through the warped window pane, touching the table, the chairs, the spoon on the sill. Jakob woke before Elias. He didn't stretch, didn't rise quickly. He just lay there for a moment, eyes open, taking in the world as it was, quiet, undemanding, survivable. When he did rise, it was with old grace, not stiffness, familiarity. He lit the stove, not the hearth, just enough to warm water. The fire kindled without resistance, a flame small, respectful. He poured tea, no rush. The steam rose in ribbons. Outside, the snow had begun to recede from the path, not meltricide, as if it, too, knew when to step back. The fig tree's tips were budding. A single crow sat in its branches, not cawing, just watching. Jakob opened the door, let the cold in, not enough to sting, just enough to remember. Elias descended the ladder, barefoot, hair wild, eyes still half closed. He looked around. You didn't start the fire. I didn't need to, Jakob said. They sat together, 2 cups. No conversation for the first few minutes, just breath, just tea. Then Elias spoke. Are we done? Jakob looked at him, not surprised, just steady. I think we are, he said. Elias nodded, then smiled, not wide, not performative. Just the smile of someone who'd waited a long time for a burden to end, and found it had, quietly, in the night. They didn't pack anything. There was nowhere to go. The cottage was still theirs. But the role, the shadow, the weight, they were not. Later that day, a child passed by and left a ribbon on the fence. Blue, same as the one that once tied the carving knife. No note, no meaning assigned, just color, just offering. Jakob tied it to the post and stepped back inside. The door closed with the sound of home, and the ledger still resting quietly on the shelf remained shut. It would not be opened again, because sometimes the final sentence isn't written, it's lived. and it whispers in the hush between snow and spring. You stayed, and that was enough. Thank you for staying with me through this long and quiet journey. If you're still here, perhaps still awake, perhaps Drift and I want you to know how much it means. These stories, these forgotten lives, they come alive because someone chooses to listen. And tonight, that someone was you. If this made you feel a little less alone, a little more seen, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Only if it feels right, of course. No pressure. Just an open door. And if you'd like, leave a comment below, maybe just where you're listening from, or what time it is where you are. I always like to imagine who's out there in the dark with me. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. Sleep softly, and from my quiet little corner of history to yours, good night.